The blood on Sarah Martinez's scrubs had dried to a rust-colored stain that would never wash out, just like the memory of watching a 19-year-old soldier flatline twice in her arms before she managed to bring him back. 2:17 a.m. glowed on her phone screen as she trudged through the Metro General Hospital parking garage, her Nike sneakers squeaking against the concrete with each exhausted step. 12 hours. That's how long she'd been on her feet, moving from trauma bay to trauma bay, holding hands with the dying, celebrating with the living, and pretending she wasn't slowly drowning in a sea of medical bills and single motherhood. Her Honda Civic sat in the far corner of Level B, right where she always parked it to avoid the dings and scrapes from the doctor's BMWs and Mercedes. The car was 15 years old, held together by prayer and duct tape, but it was hers. More importantly, it was paid for, unlike everything else in her life. Sarah fumbled for her keys, her fingers trembling from a combination of caffeine withdrawal and pure exhaustion. Emma's school picture smiled up at her from her keychain, gap-toothed and radiant, completely unaware that mommy had been surviving on ramen noodles and hope for the past 6 months just to keep their tiny apartment. 8 years old and already asking why they couldn't go to McDonald's like her friends, why mommy always looked so tired, why daddy wasn't around anymore. The sound of scuffling echoed through the concrete cavern of the parking garage. Sarah froze, keys halfway to the lock. Late-night hospital parking garages weren't exactly known for their safety, but Phoenix PD had been cutting patrols due to budget constraints. She'd heard the rumors: 3 nurses robbed in the past month, security cameras that hadn't worked in years, and a hospital administration that cared more about their liability insurance than employee safety. She should get in her car, lock the doors, drive home to Emma, who was sleeping soundly at Mrs. Quode Rodriguez's apartment upstairs, probably dreaming of bicycles and birthday parties that Sarah couldn't afford to throw. Another sound. This time it was distinctly human, a grunt of pain, followed by the sharp crack of something hard meeting flesh. "Please, I don't have anything." The voice was young, desperate, with the slight accent of someone who'd grown up switching between English and Spanish, depending on which grandmother was cooking dinner. Sarah's nursing instincts overrode her common sense. She'd taken an oath, hadn't she? To do no harm, to help those in need. It didn't say anything about only helping people inside the hospital walls. She crept toward the sounds, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Around the corner, behind a massive concrete pillar, 3 figures in hoodies surrounded a 4th person pressed against the wall. Even in the dim fluorescent lighting, she could see the distinctive camouflage pattern of military fatigues. The soldier couldn't have been older than 20, Hispanic, with the lean build of someone who'd been running 5 miles before most people had their first cup of coffee. His face was already swelling from repeated blows, blood trickling from his nose and split lip. One of his attackers held a knife that caught the sickly yellow light. "Check his pockets again, man. Military guys always got cash." "I already told you," the soldier gasped. "I just got back from deployment. Haven't even been to the bank yet." "Bullshit. You lying to us, army boy? Marines?" The young man corrected reflexively, then immediately winced as if he regretted opening his mouth. Sarah's hands moved to her phone automatically, but the attackers were too close to their victim. By the time police arrived, if they arrived, this kid would be bleeding out on the garage floor. She'd seen enough knife wounds in the ER to know how quickly someone could die from the wrong cut in the wrong place. She stepped into the light. "Hey!" Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent years commanding respect in life or death situations. "I'm a registered nurse, and this man needs medical attention. You need to step away from him right now." The 3 attackers turned toward her, and Sarah immediately realized she'd made a terrible mistake. Their pupils were dilated, movements jittery, definitely high on something that made rational thinking impossible. The one with the knife grinned, revealing teeth that had seen better decades. "Look what we got here, another hero." "I'm not looking for trouble," Sarah said, raising her hands in what she hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "I just want to help him. Then we'll all walk away, and nobody has to get hurt." "Nobody has to get hurt?" The leader laughed, a sound like broken glass. "Lady, you just volunteered yourself for the hurt train." Sarah's mind raced through her options. Her car was 20 yards away. The hospital entrance was 50. The security desk was unmanned after midnight. The emergency panic button was in her pocket, but it only worked inside the hospital. The Marine, barely more than a boy, really caught her eye. Private, judging by his collar. Danny Torres, according to his name tape. He shook his head slightly, mouthing the word, "Run." Instead, Sarah took another step forward. "Listen, I have about $40 in my wallet. Take it and leave him alone. He's just a kid. $40? The leader's voice cracked with drug-fueled indignation. You think we're here for your lunch money? This is about respect, about people thinking they're better than us. The knife moved closer to Danny's throat. Sarah made her choice. If you hurt him, you'll have to go through me first. The words hung in the stale parking garage air like a challenge thrown down in an Old West saloon. Sarah Martinez, single mother, overworked nurse, woman who hadn't been in a fight since middle school, had just declared war on 3 armed drug addicts. And somewhere in the back of her mind, as she watched the leader's expression shift from amusement to anger, she wondered if Emma would remember her as the mom who tried to do the right thing, or just as the mom who never came home. The first thing Sarah learned about knife fights was that they happened much faster than they showed in movies. The leader lunged at her with a wild swing that would have opened her throat if she hadn't jerked backward, her nursing clogs skidding on the polished concrete. The blade whistled past her face, close enough that she could smell the rust and dried blood already coating the steel. You want to be a hero, bitch? Let's see how heroic you feel. Sarah's 12 years of emergency nursing had taught her to function under pressure, but nothing had prepared her for the raw panic of someone actively trying to kill her. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, but the second attacker, a skinny kid who couldn't have been older than 16, knocked it from her grasp. It skittered across the floor and disappeared under a parked SUV. "Danny, run!" she screamed, even as she backpedaled toward her car. But Private Torres was already moving. Despite his injuries, he launched himself at the third attacker, tackling him around the waist. They went down hard, the impact echoing through the parking garage like a gunshot. The distraction cost Sarah dearly. The leader's second swing caught her across the left forearm as she tried to block, the blade parting her scrubs and the flesh beneath like tissue paper. Pain exploded up her arm, bright and immediate, and absolutely nothing like the neat wounds she'd seen in textbooks. This was ragged, violent, personal. She stumbled backward, clutching her arm, blood seeping between her fingers. The leader grinned and advanced, sensing victory. "Should have minded your own business, nurse lady." Sarah's back hit her Honda Civic. Nowhere left to run. That's when her training kicked in. 12 years of emergency medicine had taught her anatomy better than any self-defense class ever could. She knew exactly where the femoral artery ran down the inside of the thigh, how much pressure it took to collapse a trachea, which nerve clusters would drop a person instantly. As the leader raised his knife for what he clearly intended to be a finishing blow, Sarah drove her knee upward with every ounce of strength she had left. The impact lifted him off his feet. He dropped like a stone, curled in a fetal position, whimpering. The knife clattered away across the concrete. But Sarah's moment of triumph lasted exactly 3 seconds. The skinny kid had produced his own blade, a cheap switchblade that looked like it had been shoplifted from a gas station. Unlike his leader, he didn't waste time with threats or posturing. He simply stabbed her. The first wound punched through her right side, just below the ribs. Sarah felt the steel part her muscle and scrape against bone before withdrawing with a wet sound that would haunt her dreams for months afterward. She gasped, more from shock than pain. The adrenaline was keeping the worst of it at bay, for now. The second strike caught her in the left shoulder as she tried to turn away, the blade grinding against her shoulder blade before the kid yanked it free. This time she screamed, a sound of pure animal pain that echoed off the concrete walls. "Stop fighting and it'll be over quick," the kid said, almost conversationally, as if he were discussing the weather. Sarah's vision grayed around the edges. Blood loss, shock, or both. She could feel her legs getting wobbly, her coordination deteriorating. In the ER, she would have been calling for 2 units of O-negative and a trauma surgeon. Here, she was just another victim bleeding out in a hospital parking garage. But even as her body began to fail her, her mind remained sharp, clear, focused on the one thing that mattered more than her own survival. Danny Torres was losing his fight with the third attacker. The Marine was tough, trained, but he'd already been beaten before the real fight started. She could see him weakening, see the other man getting the upper hand. In 30 seconds, maybe less, Danny would be dead. The skinny kid raised his knife again, aiming for her chest this time. Center mass, the kind of wound that would punch through her sternum and into her heart. Sarah caught his wrist. She didn't have the strength to stop him. Not anymore. But she had just enough left to redirect him. Instead of her chest, the blade drove into her left arm, just below the elbow. The fourth wound. She felt the steel scrape against her ulna before lodging in the muscle. The kid tried to pull the knife free for another strike, but Sarah's blood had made the handle slippery. It twisted in his grip, and for a moment, he was off balance. Sarah used that moment to drive her thumb into his eye. Not hard enough to blind him permanently. She was a nurse, not a killer, but hard enough to send him stumbling backward, screaming and clutching his face. The knife remained embedded in her arm. She looked toward Danny and saw that the third attacker had gotten behind him, arm around his throat in a chokehold. The Marine's face was turning purple, maybe 10 seconds before he passed out, 30 before permanent brain damage. Sarah pulled the switchblade from her own arm. The pain was indescribable, like someone had filled her veins with molten lead. Blood poured from the wound, soaking her scrubs, pooling on the concrete beneath her feet. But the knife was free, and she had a weapon. She stumbled toward Danny and his attacker, each step sending fresh waves of agony through her wounded body. The man choking Danny saw her coming, but couldn't release his grip without giving the Marine a chance to fight back. Sarah drove the blade into his thigh. Not deep enough to hit the femoral artery, she wasn't trying to kill him, just disable him, but deep enough to make him let go of Danny with a howl of pain and rage. It also put her within arm's reach of someone who outweighed her by 60 pounds and wasn't currently bleeding from multiple stab wounds. His fist caught her in the temple, a blow that sent her sprawling across the concrete. The world spun, colors bleeding together like a watercolor painting left in the rain. She tried to push herself up, but her left arm wouldn't support her weight. The muscle had been severed. The attacker limped toward her, pulling the switchblade from his leg. His face was a mask of fury and pain. "You stupid bitch. You just bought yourself a world of hurt." But Danny Torres was still alive, still fighting. The Marine had gotten to his feet and was advancing on the man threatening Sarah. Even beaten, bloodied, and half-strangled, Private Torres moved with the fluid grace of someone trained to kill efficiently. The attacker saw him coming and panicked. Instead of finishing Sarah, he turned to face the new threat. Bad mistake. Danny Torres might have been young, but he'd been trained by the best military in the world. The attacker had been trained by street corners and meth labs. It wasn't even close. Danny's first punch broke the man's nose with a sound like a branch snapping. The second caved in 2 ribs. The third put him on the ground, unconscious or dead. Sarah couldn't tell which from where she lay. But the victory came too late for her. The leader had recovered from Sarah's knee strike and was back on his feet, his original knife in his hand. While Danny had been dealing with the third attacker, he'd flanked around behind the Marine. "Danny, behind you!" Sarah tried to scream, but it came out as barely more than a whisper. Danny started to turn, but he was a fraction of a second too slow. The knife went into his back, just below the shoulder blade, angled downward toward his heart. Danny staggered but didn't fall. Instead, he spun around and grabbed his attacker by the throat. For a moment, the 2 men stood locked together like dancers, one trying to drive his knife deeper, the other trying to crush his windpipe. Then Danny's legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees, the knife still protruding from his back. The leader stood over him, breathing hard, preparing to finish what he'd started. Sarah Martinez, stabbed 7 times, bleeding to death on a parking garage floor, made one final choice. She used the last of her strength to crawl toward them, her blood leaving a trail across the concrete like a crimson snail's track. By the time she reached Danny, her vision had narrowed to a tunnel, her hearing reduced to the thunderous sound of her own heartbeat, but her hands still remembered 12 years of emergency nursing. She pressed her palm against the entry wound on Danny's back, sealing it as best she could. With her other hand, the one that could still grip properly, she reached for the pressure points on his neck, checking for a pulse. Weak but steady. He was alive. The leader looked down at her in amazement. "Lady, you are one crazy bitch. You know that?" Sarah managed to look up at him, her face pale as paper but her eyes burning with defiance. "I'm a nurse," she whispered. "This is what we do." And then she reached into her pocket and pressed the panic button that connected directly to 911 dispatch. The leader heard the electronic beep and realized what she'd done. His face twisted with rage and he raised his knife one final time. But Sarah Martinez had bought them the time they needed. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer by the second. The first thing Sarah saw when she woke up was her own IV bag hanging next to her hospital bed, the clear fluid dripping steadily into her bloodstream like liquid hope. The second thing she saw was Dr. Patricia Hawkins standing at the foot of her bed with a clipboard and an expression that could freeze helium. "Ms. Martinez." Dr. Hawkins didn't sit down, didn't ask how Sarah was feeling, didn't even acknowledge that they'd worked in the same hospital for 6 years. "We need to discuss your employment status." Sarah tried to speak, but her throat felt like she'd been gargling with broken glass. A nurse, someone from the day shift she didn't recognize, handed her a cup of ice chips without making eye contact. Even the nursing staff was treating her like she had some kind of contagious disease. "My what?" Sarah managed to croak. Dr. Hawkins consulted her clipboard with the detached efficiency of someone delivering a diagnosis of terminal cancer. As of this morning, you've been placed on administrative leave pending our internal investigation into the incident. Investigation? The word came out sharper than Sarah had intended, but she was too stunned to modulate her tone. I was stabbed 7 times saving someone's life. What exactly are you investigating? Your decision to involve yourself in a violent altercation on hospital property has created significant liability concerns for Metro General. Dr. Hawkins spoke in the same clinical monotone she used to discuss quarterly budget reports. Our legal department needs to determine whether the hospital could be held responsible for any actions you took while technically still on our premises. Sarah stared at her supervisor, a woman she'd respected, worked alongside, trusted, and felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with her injuries. Liability concerns? Sarah repeated slowly. I stopped 3 men from murdering a soldier, and you're worried about liability? You involved yourself in a criminal matter that resulted in multiple serious injuries and potential lawsuits. The hospital's insurance carrier has already been contacted by attorneys representing the individuals who were injured in the altercation. The individuals who... Sarah's voice rose to a pitch that made her throat burn. You mean the drug addicts who were trying to kill us? They're suing the hospital? Dr. Hawkins finally looked up from her clipboard, and Sarah saw something in those pale blue eyes that made her blood run cold. Not malice, not anger, but complete indifference. She was a problem to be managed, a liability to be contained. That's exactly why you're on administrative leave, Miss Martinez. Until we can determine the full scope of our potential legal exposure, you cannot return to work. The door opened behind Dr. Hawkins, and Detective Marcus Reed walked in like he owned the place. Mid-40s, built like a man who'd been in decent shape 20 years ago and was still coasting on the memory, with the dead eyes of someone who'd seen enough violence to stop caring about any of it. Miss Martinez. He didn't introduce himself, didn't show a badge, just pulled out a worn notebook and flipped it open. I need to ask you some questions about last night. Are you arresting me? Sarah asked, suddenly very aware that she was wearing nothing but a hospital gown and was hooked up to machines that would make running away impossible. Should I be? Reed's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Why don't you tell me what happened, and we'll see where we stand? Sarah looked back and forth between Dr. Hawkins and Detective Reed, and for the first time since waking up, she fully understood the situation she was in. They weren't treating her like a victim. They weren't treating her like a hero. They were treating her like a suspect. I want a lawyer, she said. Reed's eyebrows went up in mock surprise. Interesting response from someone who claims she was just trying to help. Makes a person wonder what you might be trying to hide. I'm not hiding anything, but I've been a nurse long enough to know that when authority figures start treating victims like criminals, it's time to protect yourself. Dr. Hawkins made a note on her clipboard. I'll make sure HR documents your request for legal representation. It will be part of your permanent file. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah Martinez, the woman who'd worked double shifts and covered for colleagues who called in sick, who'd stayed late to hold hands with dying patients, who'd never been written up for anything more serious than wearing the wrong color scrubs, was now officially a problem employee. Where's Danny? Sarah asked. Private Torres, is he okay? The other individual involved in the altercation is recovering, Reed said, deliberately vague. Why do you ask? Did you know him before last night? I'd never seen him before in my life. Then why risk your own safety to help a complete stranger? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah stared at Detective Reed, trying to understand how saving someone's life had somehow become suspicious behavior. Because it was the right thing to do, she said finally. Reed made a note in his book. Uh-huh. And you just happened to be in that parking garage at 2 a.m., why exactly? I was getting off my shift. Long shift. 12 hours. Must have been tired. Maybe not thinking clearly. Sarah felt the first stirrings of real anger cutting through her pain medication haze. I was thinking clearly enough to save a Marine's life. So you say. Reed closed his notebook with a snap. Here's what I think happened, Miss Martinez. I think you knew those 3 men. I think this was some kind of drug deal gone wrong, and you're playing the hero angle to cover your tracks. The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She actually gasped, her heart rate monitor beginning to beep faster as her pulse spiked. That's insane. I'm a registered nurse with no criminal record. I've never used drugs in my life. A lot of healthcare workers get hooked on pills. Easy access, high-stress job. Happens more than you might think. Dr. Hawkins was nodding along, as if this made perfect sense to her. We'll be conducting mandatory drug screening as part of our investigation, of course. Of course, Sarah repeated numbly. Detective Reed tucked his notebook away. I'm going to be real straight with you, lady. I've got 3 men in the hospital because of what happened last night. One of them might never walk right again after you stuck that knife in his leg. They're claiming self-defense, saying you and your military buddy jumped them. That's not what happened. Prove it. Reed shrugged. You got any witnesses who aren't involved in the fight? Security cameras? Sarah's heart sank. The cameras haven't worked in years. Everyone knows that. Convenient. Reed stood up, straightening his jacket. Here's how this works, Miss Martinez. You stay available for further questioning. You don't leave town. And you think real hard about whether there's anything else you want to tell me before I have to start digging into your background. He was halfway to the door when Sarah called after him. What about the real criminals? The men who attacked us? Are you investigating them at all? Reed turned back with that cold smile. Lady, as far as I can tell, you're the one who escalated a simple mugging into a multiple stabbing incident. If anyone's the criminal here, it might just be you. After he left, Dr. Hawkins remained behind for a moment, studying Sarah with clinical detachment. I want you to understand something, Ms. Martinez. Metro General Hospital has served this community for 43 years. We have a reputation to maintain. Whatever personal issues drove you to make the choices you made last night, they cannot be allowed to damage this institution. Personal issues? Sarah struggled to sit up straighter, ignoring the pain that shot through her bandaged torso. What personal issues? Financial problems? Single motherhood? The stress of your situation? Dr. Hawkins spoke as if she were reading from a psychiatric evaluation. It's not uncommon for people in your circumstances to make poor decisions when seeking validation or recognition. The words hit Sarah harder than any of the knife wounds. Dr. Hawkins wasn't just questioning her judgment. She was pathologizing her heroism, turning her sacrifice into a symptom of psychological instability. Get out, Sarah whispered. I understand you're upset. Get out. Dr. Hawkins left without another word, taking Sarah's career, her reputation, and her faith in the system she'd served faithfully for over a decade. Sarah lay back against her hospital pillows and stared at the ceiling, trying to process what had just happened. In the space of one conversation, she'd been transformed from hero to suspect, from dedicated employee to liability risk, from someone who'd saved a life to someone who'd recklessly endangered others. And somewhere in this same hospital, Danny Torres was recovering from wounds that would have killed him if not for her actions. She wondered if anyone had bothered to tell him that his guardian angel was now being treated like a criminal. The first news report aired while Sarah was still in surgery, getting her 7th stab wound stitched closed. She would learn about it later, when her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, brought her phone to the hospital with 17 missed calls and 43 text messages, most of them from numbers she didn't recognize. Hospital employee involved in violent parking garage incident. Read the banner scrolling across Channel 7's morning news. Reporter Janet Cross stood outside Metro General's main entrance, her perfectly styled blonde hair unmoved by the desert wind, her expression conveying just the right mixture of concern and barely contained excitement. We're learning more this morning about a violent altercation in the parking garage of Metro General Hospital that left 4 people hospitalized with serious injuries, Cross announced, holding her microphone like a weapon. Sources inside the hospital confirmed that one of those injured was a Metro General employee who may have been involved in what police are calling a drug-related dispute. Sarah watched the report later on Mrs. Rodriguez's phone, propped up in her hospital bed with her left arm immobilized and her torso wrapped in enough gauze to mummify a pharaoh. Each word felt like another knife wound. Drug-related dispute, she whispered. Mrs. Rodriguez, a 70-year-old retired teacher who'd been watching Emma whenever Sarah worked late shifts, shook her head in disgust. Mija, they're not telling the truth. Everyone in the building knows you don't even drink wine with dinner. But the truth didn't seem to matter to Channel 7's investigative team. By the 6 o'clock news, they'd expanded their coverage. Exclusive. Hospital sources question employees' version of events. Janet Cross was back, this time with what she called developing details about the incident. The camera cut to an interview with someone whose face was obscured but whose voice was unmistakably that of Dr. Patricia Hawkins. The employee in question has been placed on administrative leave while we investigate her role in this violent incident, the disguised voice explained. We take any situation that might compromise patient safety or hospital security very seriously. Are you saying this employee might have endangered hospital patients? Cross pressed. I'm saying that anyone who chooses to engage in violent confrontations on hospital property is demonstrating questionable judgment that we must evaluate thoroughly. Sarah felt her blood pressure spike high enough to make the monitors beep. Violent confrontations? I was trying to save someone's life. The worst was yet to come. Channel 7 had somehow obtained Sarah's employment records. Illegally, she was sure, but proving it would require lawyers she couldn't afford. They'd found every sick day she'd taken in the past year, most of them to care for Emma when she had the flu. Every late arrival, usually because her car wouldn't start, every minor issue that could be twisted into evidence of an unreliable employee. Records show that Martinez has struggled with attendance issues and has been the subject of multiple supervisory meetings regarding workplace performance, cross-reported with the gravity usually reserved for war crimes. What the report didn't mention was that those attendance issues were 3 sick days in 18 months, or that the supervisory meetings had all resulted in commendations for her patient care. Context, Sarah was learning, was the first casualty of good television. The online comments were worse than the news reports. Typical. Some attention-seeking nurse decides to play hero, and now taxpayers have to pay for her mistakes. Why was she in the parking garage at 2 a.m. anyway? Sounds shady to me. That she was buying drugs and the deal went bad. Now she's trying to cover it up with this BS hero story. Single mother working double shifts, probably desperate for money. Maybe she was involved in whatever those guys were doing. Sarah read them all, each comment feeling like a personal attack from strangers who'd never met her but were completely confident in their judgment of her character. The anonymity of the internet had turned her neighbors into a mob, and she was the target. But it was the hospital's response that truly broke her heart. Administrator William Kowalski held a press conference 3 days after the incident, standing behind a podium in Metro General's main lobby with the hospital's logo prominently displayed behind him. He was everything a hospital administrator was supposed to be: silver-haired, well-dressed, radiating the kind of competent authority that made people trust institutions. Metro General Hospital has always prioritized the safety and security of our patients, staff, and visitors, Kowalski began, reading from prepared remarks. When one of our employees makes decisions that potentially compromise that safety, we must take appropriate action. A reporter raised her hand. Are you saying Miss Martinez made the wrong choice in trying to help? Kowalski's pause was perfectly calculated, long enough to suggest doubt without saying anything legally actionable. I'm saying that our employees receive extensive training in hospital security protocols. Those protocols exist for good reasons. When someone chooses to ignore that training and involve themselves in dangerous situations, there can be serious consequences for everyone involved. But she saved a man's life, another reporter pointed out. That remains to be determined through our investigation, Kowalski replied smoothly. What we know for certain is that her actions resulted in multiple injuries and created a significant liability exposure for this hospital. Sarah turned off Mrs. Rodriguez's phone and stared at the wall. They were making her sound like a reckless vigilante who'd escalated a minor incident into a bloodbath. The fact that she'd saved Danny Torres's life was being treated as an unproven claim, while her violation of security protocols was being presented as established fact. Her phone buzzed with another unknown number. Ms. Martinez, this is David Chen from Allied Health Coverage. I'm calling about your workers' compensation claim. Sarah's heart leaped. Workers' comp would cover her medical bills and provide some income while she was unable to work. It was the one piece of good news she'd been desperately hoping for. Yes, thank you for calling. When can I expect? I'm afraid I have to inform you that your claim has been denied. The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Denied? On what grounds? Our investigation determined that your injuries occurred outside the scope of your normal work duties. While the incident took place on hospital property, you were not engaged in activities related to your employment as a registered nurse when you chose to involve yourself in the altercation. I was walking to my car after completing a 12-hour shift. According to our review, you made a conscious decision to engage with individuals involved in criminal activity. That decision was not related to your duties as a hospital employee, and therefore does not qualify for workers' compensation coverage. Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. No income, mounting medical bills, and now no workers' comp to bridge the gap. This is insane! I was attacked while trying to help someone. I understand your frustration, Miss Martinez, but our decision is final. You do have the right to appeal, of course, but I should warn you that very few appeals are successful in cases involving voluntary participation in violent incidents. Voluntary participation? Sarah's voice cracked with outrage. I was stabbed 7 times? By individuals you chose to confront, rather than calling security or police as hospital protocol requires. I'm sorry, but there's nothing more I can do. The line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone, watching her reflection in the black screen. 3 days ago, she'd been a dedicated nurse with a spotless record, and the respect of her colleagues. Now she was an unemployed single mother with no income, crushing medical bills, and a reputation in ruins. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from an unknown number. "Saw you on the news? Hope you learned your lesson about sticking your nose where it don't belong." Then another, "Fake hero bitch. Hope they throw you in jail where you belong." And another, "Your daughter must be so proud of her criminal mommy." The mention of Emma made Sarah's blood run cold. Somehow, the online mob had connected her to her 8-year-old daughter. She frantically scrolled through social media, her heart pounding, looking for any mention of Emma's name or school. She found it on Facebook. Someone had posted a photo of Emma's class picture from Lincoln Elementary School with the caption, "Is this the daughter of that psycho nurse? Feel sorry for this kid having a mother like that?" Sarah called Mrs. Rodriguez immediately. "Emma's fine, mija," the older woman assured her. "She's here with me, doing her homework. But you should know, there were reporters at the school today. The principal had to call security. They went to her school, asking questions about Emma, about you. The teachers wouldn't talk to them, but some of the other parents." Mrs. Rodriguez's voice trailed off. "What did they say?" "Nothing good, mi amor. Nothing good." Sarah hung up and buried her face in her hands. It wasn't enough that they were destroying her reputation and her career. Now they were going after her daughter, an innocent 8-year-old whose only crime was having a mother who'd tried to do the right thing. Outside her hospital window, she could see news vans still parked in the hospital's parking lot, their satellite dishes pointing toward the sky like metal flowers turned toward an unforgiving sun. The reporters were waiting for her to be discharged, so they could get footage of her walking out, probably with some narrator talking about the disgraced nurse or the woman whose heroic claims are being questioned. Sarah Martinez, who'd never been in trouble with the law, never been fired from a job, never been anything but a dedicated single mother and caring healthcare worker, was learning what it felt like to be the villain in someone else's story. And the worst part was, she was starting to believe it herself. The eviction notice was taped to Sarah's apartment door like a yellow flag of surrender, the legal language as impersonal as a death certificate. Notice to quit. You are hereby required to quit and surrender to the landlord the premises herein described, and in default of such quittance and surrender, legal proceedings will be instituted against you. Sarah ripped it down with shaking hands, her left arm still weak from the knife wounds, her right barely steady enough to hold the paper. 30 days. She had 30 days to find. $200 for back rent, plus the $800 late fee, plus next month's rent, plus the money she didn't have for the medical bills that kept arriving in her mailbox like love letters from hell. Mrs. Rodriguez opened her door across the hallway, Emma's small hand clutching her house dress. "Mama?" Emma's voice was tiny, confused. "Why are you crying?" Sarah quickly folded the eviction notice and forced a smile. "I'm not crying, baby. Just allergies." But Emma was 8 years old, not 8 months old. She could read the fear in her mother's eyes, could sense the way the walls of their small world were closing in around them. "Are we going to have to move again?" Emma asked. Again. The word hit Sarah like a slap. This was supposed to be their forever home, their chance to finally settle down after 3 moves in 2 years, as Sarah chased better jobs and cheaper rent. Emma had just started to make friends at Lincoln Elementary, had finally stopped asking when they were going home to their old apartment. "We'll figure it out, sweetheart. We always do." But Sarah wasn't sure they would this time. The math was simple and brutal. 0 income plus mounting expenses equals homelessness. Even if she could find another nursing job, which seemed unlikely given the media coverage and the hospital's determination to paint her as an unstable employee, it would take weeks to get hired and start earning again. Her phone buzzed. Another bill collector, probably, or another reporter looking for a quote about her reckless behavior. She almost ignored it, but the caller ID showed Metro General HR. "Ms. Martinez?" The voice belonged to Jennifer Walsh from Human Resources, the same woman who'd processed Sarah's hiring paperwork 6 years ago. "I need to inform you that your employment with Metro General Hospital has been terminated, effective immediately." Sarah sank onto her couch, the eviction notice falling from her nerveless fingers. "On what grounds?" "Violation of hospital security protocols, conduct detrimental to the hospital's reputation, and..." Jennifer paused, clearly reading from a script, "failure to maintain the professional standards expected of Metro General employees." "What professional standards?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "I saved a man's life. The hospital's investigation concluded that your actions created significant liability exposure and brought negative attention to the institution. Your final paycheck will be mailed to you within 7 business days, minus deductions for uniforms not returned, and administrative processing fees. Administrative processing fees. They were actually charging her money for the privilege of being fired. Jennifer, you know me. We worked together for 6 years. You know I'm not what they're saying I am. There was a long pause. When Jennifer spoke again, her voice was softer, almost apologetic. Sarah, I'm sorry. I really am. But this comes from the top. Dr. Hawkins, Mr. Kowalski, even the board of directors. They want this whole thing to go away, and I'm the scapegoat. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. After Jennifer hung up, Sarah sat in her empty apartment and stared at the stack of bills on her coffee table. Medical bills, mostly, with amounts that looked like telephone numbers. 47, 0 for her surgery, 12, 0 for her 4-day hospital stay, 8, 0 for various tests and consultations. The hospital that had just fired her was also billing her for the privilege of saving her life. Her phone rang again. This time it was Detective Reed. Ms. Martinez, I need you to come down to the station for additional questioning. About what? I already told you everything that happened. New evidence has come to light. Seems one of your attackers is claiming you were the aggressor. Says you and your military friend jumped them for their drugs. Sarah laughed, a sound somewhere between hysteria and despair. That's insane. I was stabbed 7 times. Lot of drug deals go bad, Reed said matter-of-factly. People get hurt when they're fighting over product. What product? What drugs? Have you found any drugs? That's what we're investigating. Be here at 3 p.m., or I'll have to come get you. The line went dead. Sarah looked at the clock on her phone. 1:47 p.m. Just over an hour to figure out what to do with Emma, find a way to get to the police station, and somehow prepare herself for what was clearly going to be another attempt to frame her as a criminal. That's when the knock came at her door. Sarah peered through the peephole and saw a woman in a business suit holding an official-looking folder. Her heart sank even further, if that was possible. Ms. Martinez? I'm Janet Hoffman from Child Protective Services. Sarah's world tilted sideways. She fumbled with the locks, her injured arm making the simple task almost impossible. When she finally got the door open, Emma had appeared at her side, pressing close against her mother's leg. What's this about? Sarah asked, though she already knew. Janet Hoffman was in her 50s, with the kind of worn face that came from dealing with the worst of human nature on a daily basis. She looked at Emma with professional compassion and at Sarah with professional suspicion. We received a report about your living situation. May I come in? It wasn't really a question. Sarah stepped aside, watching helplessly as the CPS worker surveyed her small apartment with the practiced eye of someone cataloging deficiencies. The eviction notice on the coffee table, the stack of unpaid bills, the near-empty refrigerator that Sarah had tried to hide behind a strategically placed cereal box. Emma, sweetheart, why don't you go to your room and play for a few minutes while I talk to your mother? Emma looked up at Sarah with wide, frightened eyes. Am I in trouble, Mama? No, baby. Just go play. I'll be right here. After Emma disappeared into her bedroom, Janet Hoffman sat down across from Sarah and opened her folder. I'm going to be direct with you, Ms. Martinez. We've received information suggesting that your current circumstances may not be suitable for raising a minor child. What circumstances? Sarah's voice was getting higher, more desperate. I love my daughter. I've never hurt her, never neglected her, but you have exposed her to dangerous situations. The recent violent incident, the media attention, the threats you've been receiving. Janet consulted her notes. We understand there were reporters at her school asking questions about her family. That's not my fault. I didn't invite media attention. Nevertheless, your choices have created an unstable environment for Emma. Combined with your recent termination, your mounting financial problems, and the pending criminal investigation. Criminal investigation? Sarah interrupted. I'm the victim here. Janet Hoffman's expression didn't change. Ms. Martinez, I need to inform you that unless you can demonstrate adequate housing, employment, and a stable environment for Emma within the next 72 hours, we'll have no choice but to place her in protective custody. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She actually gasped, her hand flying to her chest as if she'd been shot. You can't take my daughter. She's all I have. No one wants to break up families, Miss Martinez, but our first priority has to be Emma's safety and well-being. Right now, those appear to be at risk. Sarah looked toward Emma's bedroom, where she could hear her daughter playing with her dolls, completely unaware that her entire world was about to be destroyed by adults who claimed to be helping. This is because of the news reports, isn't it? Someone saw me on TV and decided I must be a bad mother. Janet Hoffman closed her folder. I can't discuss the source of our referral. What I can tell you is that you have 72 hours to secure stable housing, demonstrate a reliable income source, and provide evidence that Emma's environment is safe and appropriate for a minor child. After the CPS worker left, Sarah sat alone in her living room and tried to do the math. 72 hours to find a job, secure an apartment, and convince the world that she wasn't the monster they'd made her out to be. It was impossible. Completely, utterly impossible. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Court hearing tomorrow at 9 a.m. Emergency custody determination. Bring representation if possible. J. Hoffman. Sarah stared at the message until the words blurred together. Tomorrow morning, she would walk into a courtroom and fight for the right to keep her own daughter. She would face a judge who'd probably seen the news reports, read the articles calling her judgment into question, heard the hospital administrator questioning her professional standards, and she would lose. Because in America, being a hero was apparently a crime, and trying to save someone's life was evidence of unfitness as a parent. Sarah Martinez, who had asked for nothing more than the chance to work hard and raise her daughter in peace, was about to lose everything because she'd made the mistake of caring about a stranger's life more than her own safety. The system she'd trusted, served, and believed in had turned against her with the efficiency of a machine designed to destroy hope. And tomorrow, they would take the one thing that made her life worth living. Danny Torres found Sarah's address in the phone book, an old-fashioned method that seemed appropriate for someone trying to do something genuinely honorable in a world that had apparently forgotten what honor meant. He stood outside her apartment complex for 20 minutes, working up the courage to knock on her door, rehearsing what he wanted to say. The building was exactly what he'd expected. A two-story complex with peeling paint and broken concrete, the kind of place where people lived when they were working as hard as they could, but still couldn't quite make it. It reminded him of the neighborhood where he'd grown up in Tucson, before his grandmother's prayers and a Marine recruiter had given him another path. Danny was wearing his dress blues, the uniform he'd earned through 13 weeks of hell at Parris Island and 2 deployments that had aged him about 10 years in the past 18 months. The uniform was important. It said things about duty and honor that civilian clothes couldn't express. It announced to the world that the man wearing it had sworn an oath to protect people like Sarah Martinez, even if the system had forgotten that oath applied to heroes as well as strangers. He'd been discharged from the hospital 3 days earlier, his back still aching where the knife had punched between his ribs and barely missed his lung. The scar would be with him forever, a reminder of how close he'd come to dying in a parking garage 1,000 miles from Afghanistan. But it was also a reminder that someone had cared enough to save his life, and that debt demanded payment. The news reports had made him sick with rage. Watching them twist Sarah's heroism into something dark and suspicious, seeing her treated like a criminal instead of the woman who'd bled for him, had triggered something in Danny that his military training had taught him to recognize and control. But this wasn't about control. This was about doing what was right when everyone else had chosen to do what was convenient. Danny knocked on apartment 2B. The woman who answered the door looked like she'd aged 20 years since the night she'd saved his life. Her left arm was still in a sling, her face pale and drawn with the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. But her eyes, those same dark eyes that had looked at him with such fierce determination in the parking garage, still carried that spark of defiance that had kept them both alive. Private Torres. Her voice was soft, surprised. How did you find me? Phone book. Old school, I know. Danny tried to smile, but it came out awkward. He'd spent more time talking to insurgents than to the women who'd saved his life. I wanted to see how you were doing. Sarah looked past him, scanning the parking lot for news vans or reporters. You shouldn't be here. The media's been following me, and if they see you, let them see me. Danny's voice carried the edge of someone who'd learned to project authority despite being only 19 years old. Maybe it's time someone told them the truth about what happened. Sarah stepped aside to let him in, and Danny got his first look at how the system had rewarded her heroism. The apartment was small, clean, but obviously the home of someone living paycheck to paycheck. Bills were stacked on the coffee table next to an eviction notice. A little girl's drawings were taped to the refrigerator, stick figures of a woman in scrubs and a smaller figure with pigtails, both smiling under a yellow crayon sun. Is that your daughter? Danny asked. Emma. Sarah's voice softened when she said the name. She's at school. I didn't want her here when things got complicated. Danny noticed she didn't say, when things got bad, or when everything fell apart. Even now, when her world was collapsing around her, Sarah Martinez was choosing her words to protect her daughter from the full weight of their situation. Miss Martinez, I need you to know something. Danny turned to face her directly, the way he'd been taught to deliver important information. The doctors told me that if you hadn't applied pressure to that artery, I would have bled out in about 4 minutes. Everything you did, getting between me and those guys, keeping me conscious, calling for help, all of that saved my life. Sarah looked down at her hands. I'm a nurse. It's what we do. No. Danny's voice was firm. It's what you did, and I've been watching the news, reading the papers. They're lying about you, all of them. Sarah finally looked up at him, and Danny saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten with anger. Defeat. The woman who'd fought 3 armed attackers to save a stranger was giving up. Maybe they're right, Sarah said quietly. Maybe I should have just called security, let someone else handle it. Maybe if I'd minded my own business, none of this would have happened. If you'd minded your own business, I'd be dead. The words hung in the air between them, simple and undeniable. Danny reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I wrote to my unit, told them what happened, what you did. He handed her the paper. These are some of the responses I got back. Sarah unfolded the letter with trembling fingers. It was written on Marine Corps letterhead, signed by Master Sergeant James Rodriguez. Private Torres has informed us of your actions in saving his life during a violent assault. While the civilian authorities appear to have forgotten what heroism looks like, the United States Marine Corps has not. We would be honored to meet the woman who exemplified the values we swear to uphold: courage, honor, and commitment to protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I don't understand. Danny pulled out more letters. This one's from my squad leader, Corporal Wilson. This one's from Lieutenant Hayes, my platoon commander. This one's from Colonel Martinez. No relation, I asked, who commands my entire battalion. Each letter said essentially the same thing. Sarah Martinez was a hero, and the Marine Corps recognized heroes, even when no one else would. But why? Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her good hand. You don't even know me. I know enough. Danny sat down across from her, his dress blue uniform incongruous in the shabby apartment. I know you put yourself between me and 3 armed men when you could have walked away. I know you took 7 knife wounds and still managed to keep me alive until help arrived. I know you did it for a stranger, without hesitation, because it was the right thing to do. Danny leaned forward, his young face suddenly serious beyond his years. Miss Martinez, I've been in combat. I've seen people make split-second decisions under pressure that determine who lives and who dies. What you did that night? That was warrior-level courage. The kind of courage that gets Marines the Medal of Honor. But I'm not a Marine. No, you're something better. You're a civilian who chose to act like a Marine when it mattered most. Sarah stared at the letters in her lap, reading the words of gratitude and respect from men and women who understood sacrifice in ways that hospital administrators and insurance companies never would. The news says I made everything worse, that if I'd just called for help instead of getting involved, everyone would have been safer. The news is run by people who've never had to make a life or death decision in 30 seconds, Danny said bluntly. The news is run by people who think heroism is something that only happens in movies. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where Sarah's world had started falling apart. You know what my unit calls you? They call you the guardian angel of Metro General. Because that's what you were, an angel who appeared when I needed her most. I'm no angel, I'm just a woman who made a choice. Yeah, you chose to save my life instead of protecting yourself. You chose to help a stranger instead of walking away. You chose to do what was right instead of what was easy. Danny turned back to face her. That's exactly what an angel would do. Sarah was crying now, but for the first time in days, they weren't tears of despair. I might lose my daughter, she whispered. Child Services says I'm unfit to be a mother because of what happened. Danny's expression hardened. What? Court hearing tomorrow. They want to take Emma into protective custody because I've created an unstable environment. For a moment, Danny Torres looked every bit the trained killer he'd been shaped into by the Marine Corps. His jaw set, his eyes narrowed, and his hands clenched into fists that had been trained to break bones. That's not going to happen. You don't understand. I lost my job, I'm being evicted. The police think I'm a criminal. I have nothing to fight them with. You have me. Danny's voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with witnesses to the truth. You have my unit. You have the entire United States Marine Corps. What do you mean? Danny smiled for the first time since entering her apartment, and it transformed his young face into something bright and determined. Miss Martinez, you saved the life of a United States Marine. That makes you family, and Marines don't let family fight alone. He was already reaching for his phone, scrolling through contacts. Master Sergeant Rodriguez? It's Torres. Yes, sir, I found her. Sir, we have a situation that requires immediate attention. They're trying to take her daughter away. Sarah watched as Danny Torres, 19 years old and still healing from wounds that should have killed him, marshaled the forces of the United States Marine Corps to defend the woman who'd saved his life. And for the first time in a week, she allowed herself to hope. Sarah Martinez sat in the hallway outside Family Courtroom 3B at 8:30 a.m., clutching a manila folder that contained her entire defense. Employment termination letter, medical bills, character references from colleagues who'd written them before the media storm hit, and Danny Torres's letters from his Marine unit. It felt pathetically thin compared to the thick briefcase carried by the Child Protective Services attorney who'd walked past her 20 minutes earlier without making eye contact. Emma sat beside her, swinging her legs and coloring in a book that featured smiling dinosaurs and cheerful rainbows, images that seemed to mock the dark reality of what was about to happen. Sarah had tried to explain the situation in terms an 8-year-old could understand. We have to talk to a judge today about our family. But Emma was smart enough to sense the fear radiating from her mother like heat from a fever. Mama, why are you shaking? Sarah looked down at her hands and realized Emma was right. She was trembling like someone with hypothermia, her body's involuntary response to the knowledge that in 30 minutes, a stranger in a black robe would decide whether she was fit to raise her own child. I'm just cold, baby. It's not cold in here. No, it wasn't. The courthouse was kept at a steady 72 degrees, but Sarah felt like she was sitting naked in a snowstorm. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, the voices in the hallway too loud, the entire world too much to process, while her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her court-appointed attorney, a harried-looking woman named Lisa Chen, who looked like she'd slept in her car, sat down beside them with a coffee-stained legal pad and the expression of someone who'd already lost the case in her mind. Miss Martinez, I have to be honest with you. This isn't going to be easy. CPS has built a strong case around the recent events, and Judge Morrison tends to err on the side of caution when it comes to child welfare. What does that mean? Sarah asked, though she already knew. It means he'd rather place Emma in protective custody temporarily than risk leaving her in what the state considers an unstable situation. Sarah felt the world tilt sideways. How is this happening? I saved someone's life, and now they're punishing me by taking away my daughter? Lisa Chen flipped through her notes with the efficiency of someone who'd had this conversation too many times. The court isn't looking at whether you're a hero, Ms. Martinez. They're looking at risk factors. Unemployment, financial instability, recent involvement in a violent incident, ongoing police investigation, media attention that's created safety concerns. On paper, it's a compelling argument for temporary removal. On paper, I'm a dedicated mother who's never hurt her child. I know, but we're playing in their arena by their rules, and right now, those rules are stacked against us. Emma looked up from her coloring book. Mama, what's temporary removal? Sarah's heart broke a little more. Nothing you need to worry about, sweetheart. Keep coloring. But Emma was too smart to be dismissed. She'd heard enough whispered phone conversations, seen enough worried glances between her mother and Mrs. Rodriguez, absorbed enough tension from the adults around her to understand that something terrible was happening. Are they going to make me go away? The question hung in the air like a sword. Sarah looked at her daughter. This beautiful, innocent child, who'd done nothing wrong except have a mother who'd tried to help a stranger, and felt something crack inside her chest. I won't let that happen, Sarah whispered. But even as she said the words, she knew they might be a lie. At 8:55 a.m., the courtroom doors opened, and they were called inside. Judge Morrison was exactly what Sarah had feared. A white man in his 60s with the kind of stern expression that suggested he'd seen enough domestic dysfunction to assume the worst about everyone who appeared before his bench. He looked at Sarah over his reading glasses with the detached interest of someone examining a specimen under a microscope. The CPS attorney, a polished woman in her 40s named Patricia Wells, presented her case with the ruthless efficiency of someone who'd perfected the art of separating families. She laid out the timeline of events, emphasizing Sarah's decision to engage in violent confrontation and the unstable environment created by her subsequent unemployment and media attention. Your Honor, while we don't question Miss Martinez's intentions, her recent actions demonstrate a pattern of poor judgment that places the minor child at risk. The fact that reporters have been attempting to contact the child at school, that the family is facing eviction, and that there's an ongoing police investigation all point to an environment that is not in Emma's best interests. Judge Morrison made notes on his pad, occasionally glancing at Emma, who sat between Sarah and the attorney, clutching her coloring book like a shield. Ms. Chen, what's your client's response to these concerns? Lisa Chen stood up with the resigned air of someone making a last stand at the Alamo. Your Honor, Ms. Martinez is a dedicated mother with no history of abuse or neglect. The incident that precipitated these proceedings was an act of heroism, not reckless endangerment. She saved a young Marine's life at great personal cost, and she's being punished for doing the right thing. Heroism doesn't pay rent, Counselor, Judge Morrison replied dryly. What's Miss Martinez's plan for stable housing and employment? It was a fair question with no good answer. Sarah had spent the previous evening making phone calls to every hospital in the Phoenix area, but her newfound notoriety had made her unemployable. Hospital administrators were polite but firm. They couldn't risk hiring someone who might bring negative media attention to their institution. My client is actively seeking employment in her field, Your Honor. She's a skilled registered nurse with an exemplary record prior to recent events. Judge Morrison looked skeptical. Miss Martinez, do you have anything you'd like to say before I make my decision? Sarah stood up on shaking legs, acutely aware that the next few minutes would determine the rest of her life. She looked at Emma, who was staring up at her with complete trust, and felt the weight of every choice she'd made in the past week. Your Honor, I understand that on paper, my situation looks unstable, but I need you to understand who I am, not just what's happened to me. Sarah's voice was quiet, but steady. I've been a single mother for 6 years. I've worked double shifts to provide for Emma, made sure she had everything she needed even when I went without. I've never missed a parent-teacher conference, never forgotten a school play, never put anything ahead of her well-being. Sarah paused, gathering her courage for what came next. A week ago, I saw someone being murdered, and I chose to help him instead of walking away. That choice saved a young man's life, and it cost me everything. My job, my reputation, my financial security. But I would make the same choice again, because that's who I am. That's who I want Emma to grow up to be. Someone who helps others even when it's hard, even when it costs you something. Judge Morrison was listening now, his stern expression softening slightly. The people trying to take my daughter say I've created an unstable environment. But the only thing unstable about our environment is the way the system has treated us since I chose to be a hero instead of a bystander. Emma is loved, cared for, and safe with me. She always has been, and she always will be. Sarah sat down, her heart pounding, but her conscience clear. She'd told the truth, the whole truth, and now it was up to a stranger to decide if the truth was enough. Judge Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers in front of him. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable. Ms. Martinez, while I appreciate your sentiment about heroism, my primary concern has to be the child's welfare. Based on the evidence presented, I find that the courtroom doors burst open. Master Sergeant James Rodriguez entered in dress blues, followed by Corporal Jake Wilson, Lieutenant Patricia Hayes, and 3 other Marines in full uniform. They moved with military precision, taking seats in the gallery behind Sarah with the kind of disciplined silence that somehow managed to be louder than shouting. Judge Morrison looked up in surprise. Excuse me, but this is a closed hearing. Master Sergeant Rodriguez stood up. Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption. We're here to provide testimony regarding Miss Martinez's character and the circumstances of the incident that led to these proceedings. This is highly irregular. So is prosecuting a woman for saving a Marine's life, Your Honor. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Judge Morrison studied the Marines in his courtroom, clearly calculating the political implications of throwing out military personnel who'd come to defend a civilian hero. Very well. But this had better be relevant to the child welfare determination. Master Sergeant Rodriguez remained standing. It is, Your Honor, because you can't determine someone's fitness as a parent without understanding who they really are, and Sarah Martinez is a hero who deserves the protection of the people she risked her life to defend. Sarah turned in her seat, tears streaming down her face, as 6 United States Marines prepared to go to war for her right to keep her daughter. The cavalry had arrived. Master Sergeant James Rodriguez had been a Marine for 18 years, served 3 combat tours, and earned enough ribbons to cover half his chest. But he'd never felt more nervous than he did standing in Family Courtroom 3B facing Judge Morrison. This wasn't Afghanistan, where the rules of engagement were clear and the enemy wore different uniforms. This was America, where bureaucrats could destroy heroes with paperwork and good people could lose everything for doing what was right. Your Honor, Rodriguez began, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who'd commanded respect in life or death situations. My name is Master Sergeant James Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps. I'm here with my fellow Marines to provide testimony about Ms. Sarah Martinez and the incident that has brought her before this court. Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, clearly trying to process the unprecedented situation of having his courtroom invaded by Marines in dress blues. Sergeant, while I appreciate your service to our country, this is a child welfare hearing, not a military tribunal. With respect, Your Honor, it's both. Rodriguez reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder. Because what happened in that parking garage wasn't just about one woman making a brave choice. It was about the values we swear to defend. As Marines, courage, honor, and commitment to protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Sarah watched in amazement as the Master Sergeant approached the bench and handed Judge Morrison the folder. She could see Danny Torres in the gallery behind the other Marines, still in his dress blues, his young face shining with pride as his unit took up his fight. What's in this file, Sergeant? Judge Morrison asked. Letters from every Marine in Private Torres's unit, Your Honor. Witness statements from the medical personnel who treated both Private Torres and Ms. Martinez. Security footage analysis from our military police investigators. And a formal recommendation from Colonel Patricia Hayes that Ms. Martinez be awarded a civilian commendation for her actions. Rodriguez turned to face the courtroom, addressing Judge Morrison but speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. Your Honor, I've served in combat zones where split-second decisions determine who lives and who dies. I've seen Marines earn the Medal of Honor for actions that weren't any braver than what Sarah Martinez did in that parking garage. She saw someone being murdered, and instead of walking away, she put herself between 3 armed attackers and an innocent victim. She took 7 knife wounds and still managed to keep Private Torres alive until help arrived. The CPS attorney, Patricia Wells, stood up. Your Honor, while we respect Sergeant Rodriguez's service, this testimony isn't relevant to the child welfare determination. The hell it isn't. The voice belonged to Corporal Jake Wilson, who'd stood up from his seat in the gallery. At 24, Wilson was lean and hard with the kind of controlled intensity that came from 2 deployments in combat zones. You want to know if Sarah Martinez is fit to be a mother? Let me tell you what kind of woman she is. Judge Morrison raised his hand. Corporal, you're out of order. So is this entire proceeding? Wilson shot back. You've got a woman who risked her life to save one of my Marines, and instead of thanking her, you're trying to take away her daughter. Where I come from, we call that adding insult to injury. Lieutenant Patricia Hayes stood up next, her officer's bearing commanding immediate attention. At 32, she was one of the youngest Marine officers to command a platoon in active combat, with a Silver Star and 2 Purple Hearts to prove her credentials. Your Honor, may I approach? Judge Morrison nodded, clearly overwhelmed by the military presence in his courtroom. Lieutenant Hayes walked to the front of the courtroom with the confident stride of someone who'd led Marines through firefights in Fallujah and Kandahar. She was carrying a leather portfolio that looked official enough to contain state secrets. Your Honor, I'm Lieutenant Patricia Hayes, United States Marine Corps. I've reviewed the circumstances of Private Torres's rescue, and I need to put Ms. Hokeda Martinez's actions in perspective for this court. She opened her portfolio and pulled out a series of photographs, aerial shots, diagrams, what looked like tactical analysis charts. This is the parking garage where the incident occurred. Based on the positions of the vehicles, the lighting conditions, and the location of the attack, Ms. Martinez had multiple opportunities to retreat to safety. Her car was 20 yards away. The hospital entrance was 50 yards away. She could have called for help and waited for security. Sarah's heart sank. Was the Marine officer about to testify against her? Instead, Lieutenant Hayes continued, she chose to advance toward 3 armed attackers who had already demonstrated violent intent. In military terms, she deliberately moved from a position of safety into a kill zone to provide aid to a wounded comrade. The courtroom was dead silent. Your Honor, that's not reckless behavior. That's heroic behavior. The kind of behavior we train Marines to exhibit under fire. The kind of behavior that gets people the Congressional Medal of Honor. Lieutenant Hayes turned to face Sarah directly. Miss Martinez, would you stand, please? Sarah stood on shaking legs, confused and overwhelmed by the military pageantry unfolding around her. Your Honor, on behalf of the United States Marine Corps, I want to present Miss Martinez with this citation. Lieutenant Hayes handed Sarah a framed certificate with the Marine Corps emblem prominently displayed. Sarah read the text through tears that made the words blur together. The United States Marine Corps hereby recognizes Sarah Martinez for extraordinary heroism and selfless service in the rescue of Private Daniel Torres. Her actions exemplified the highest traditions of military service, Semper Fidelis, and reflect great credit upon herself and the civilian community she represents. It was signed by Colonel Patricia Hayes, commanding officer, and bore the official seal of the United States Marine Corps. But Lieutenant Hayes wasn't finished. Your Honor, there's something else this court needs to understand about Miss Martinez. She reached into her portfolio again and pulled out another document. This is a job offer. Sarah's eyes widened. What? The Department of Veterans Affairs Medical Center here in Phoenix has been following Miss Martinez's case. They're offering her a position as head trauma nurse in their emergency department, with full benefits and a salary commensurate with her experience and demonstrated courage under fire. The job offer was real. Sarah could see the official letterhead, the signature of the hospital director, the salary figure that was higher than anything she'd ever been offered. Patricia Wells, the CPS attorney, stood up again. Your Honor, while this is a generous gesture, it doesn't address the ongoing concerns about— What concerns? Master Sergeant Rodriguez interrupted. The concern that she's unemployed? She just got a job offer. The concern that she's financially unstable? The VA salary will solve that problem. The concern that she's created an unstable environment? The only instability comes from people who can't recognize heroism when they see it. Emma had been sitting quietly through the entire proceeding, but now she tugged on her mother's sleeve. Mama, are those the Marines Danny told us about? Sarah looked down at her daughter, then back at the 6 Marines who had somehow materialized in her darkest hour like guardian angels in dress blues. Yes, baby. These are Danny's friends. Emma stood up and walked over to Master Sergeant Rodriguez. At 8 years old, she barely came up to his belt, but she looked up at him with the fearless curiosity of childhood. Thank you for helping my mama, she said in her clear, sweet voice. She's a good mama, and she saved Danny's life. Rodriguez knelt down so he was at eye level with Emma, his stern expression softening into something almost tender. You're right, little lady. Your mama is a hero, and Marines protect heroes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small Marine Corps pin, the kind given to civilians as a token of respect and gratitude. This is for you, Emma, so you'll always remember that your mama did something brave and important, and that makes you part of the Marine family. Emma took the pin with reverent care, as if she understood the significance of what she was receiving. Judge Morrison had been watching the exchange with growing emotion. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, less stern. Ms. Martinez, please sit down. I think I've heard enough testimony. Sarah returned to her seat, clutching the Marine Corps citation and watching Emma examine her new pin with wide-eyed wonder. Ms. Wells, Judge Morrison addressed the CPS attorney, does the state wish to present any additional evidence? Patricia Wells looked at the Marines filling her courtroom, at the job offer in Sarah's hands, at the 8-year-old girl who was now wearing a Marine Corps pin and beaming with pride in her mother. No, Your Honor, the state rests. Judge Morrison removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, using the time to gather his thoughts. When he put them back on, he looked directly at Sarah. Ms. Martinez, a week ago, you made a choice that saved a young man's life and cost you nearly everything you'd worked to build. Today, I watched that same young man's comrades cross the country to stand up for you when no one else would. He paused, looking at Emma. The purpose of this court is to determine what's in the best interests of the child. I've listened to testimony about employment instability, financial problems, and media attention, but I've also seen something else. I've seen what kind of person Emma Martinez's mother really is. Sarah held her breath. Ms. Martinez, your daughter needs to grow up knowing that her mother is a hero. She needs to learn from your example that doing the right thing is more important than doing the easy thing. She needs to understand that sometimes the most important choices we make are the ones that cost us something. Judge Morrison picked up his gavel. The petition for emergency removal is denied. Emma Martinez will remain in her mother's custody. Court is adjourned. The sound of the gavel hitting wood was the most beautiful sound Sarah had ever heard. Better than Emma's first words, better than her first laugh, better than any music ever composed. She was still crying when Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached her. Miss Martinez, there's one more thing. He smiled, and Sarah could see the pride and satisfaction of someone who'd just completed a successful mission. There are 94 more Marines waiting outside this courthouse. They wanted to be here, but we figured 6 of us would be less intimidating than 100. Sarah looked toward the courtroom windows, and through the glass she could see them. Marines in dress blues, standing at attention in the courthouse plaza, a sea of blue and red that stretched across the entire front of the building. Why? She whispered. Why would they do this for me? Danny Torres appeared at her side, his young face shining with gratitude and pride. "Because you're family now, Ms. Martinez, and Marines never leave family behind." As Sarah Martinez walked out of the courthouse with her daughter's hand in hers and 100 Marines standing at attention in her honor, she finally understood what it meant to be truly protected by the people she'd risked everything to serve. The FBI field office in Phoenix buzzed with the kind of controlled urgency that Sarah had only seen in medical emergencies, but instead of saving lives, they were saving her reputation. Special Agent Maria Santos, a compact woman with steel-gray hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent 20 years hunting criminals, spread crime scene photos across the conference table like dealing cards. "Ms. Martinez, I want you to understand what we found when we actually bothered to investigate this case properly." Agent Santos's voice carried an edge of disgust that wasn't directed at Sarah. Detective Reed closed this investigation after 48 hours, with minimal follow-up. When the Marine Corps requested federal involvement, we discovered evidence that should have led to arrests within a week. Sarah sat across from Agent Santos, still struggling to process how quickly her world had changed. 3 days ago, she'd been fighting for custody of her daughter in family court. Now, she was in a federal building being briefed on a criminal investigation that apparently had tentacles reaching far beyond a simple parking garage mugging. "What kind of evidence?" Sarah asked. Agent Santos turned over the first photograph. It showed the knife that had been used to stab Sarah, now tagged and labeled as evidence. This blade was used in 2 other attacks over the past 6 months. Both victims were hospital employees walking to their cars after late shifts. Sarah's blood ran cold. Other nurses? A pharmacy technician and a radiology tech. Both survived, but barely. Both cases were classified as random muggings by Detective Reed and closed without arrests. The next photo showed surveillance footage from a gas station 2 blocks from the hospital. 3 men were clearly visible filling up a beat-up sedan, their faces captured in high resolution under the bright station lights. Miguel Santos, Carlos Rivera, and James Mitchell, all known associates of the Sereno gang, all with extensive criminal histories. They'd been targeting hospital employees for months, probably figuring that healthcare workers would be carrying cash and pain medications. Sarah stared at the photos. Detective Reed said the cameras at the hospital weren't working. They weren't, but these 3 made a mistake. They stopped for gas before and after your attack, using a stolen credit card. When we ran the card numbers, we found a pattern of similar transactions around the dates of the other attacks. They'd been casing Metro General for months. Agent Santos spread out more photos. "Here's where it gets interesting. We arrested all 3 of them yesterday morning. Within 6 hours, they were pointing fingers at each other and demanding plea deals. What did they say? That the whole thing was supposed to be simple. Wait for a hospital employee to walk to their car alone, rob them, maybe grab any drugs they might be carrying. But when you interfered, it turned into something much more violent than they'd planned." Sarah remembered the leader's drug-dilated pupils, the wild swinging of the knife, the sense that these weren't experienced criminals so much as desperate addicts looking for easy money. According to their statements, they were high on methamphetamine and hadn't eaten in 2 days. When you stepped in to protect Private Torres, they saw you as a threat that needed to be eliminated. Agent Santos's voice hardened. "Ms. Martinez, they were planning to kill both of you and dump the bodies in the desert. Your decision to fight back probably saved both your lives." Sarah felt sick. Detective Reed said I escalated the situation. Detective Reed is facing federal charges for obstruction of justice and accepting bribes from gang members to minimize investigations. Agent Santos's smile was razor-sharp. Turns out he's been taking money to make certain cases disappear. The hospital attacks, drug trafficking cases, even some domestic violence calls. He's been protecting criminals while treating victims like suspects. The room spun around Sarah. He was protecting them? $500 per case to file minimal reports and avoid follow-up investigations. We found the payments in his bank account, along with text messages coordinating which cases needed to disappear. Agent Santos pulled out another folder. But that's not the best part. Want to know who was helping fund Detective Reed's little side business? Sarah wasn't sure she could handle any more revelations. William Kowalski, Metro General Hospital's chief administrator. Turns out he was paying Detective Reed to minimize investigations that might create liability exposure for the hospital. Better to have victims labeled as criminals than deal with wrongful death lawsuits. The betrayal hit Sarah like a physical blow. The hospital administrator who'd publicly questioned her judgment, who'd allowed the media to paint her as reckless and unstable, had been actively working to cover up the criminal attacks that put her in danger. "He knew," Sarah whispered. He knew there had been other attacks, and he let them destroy my reputation anyway. Oh, it gets better. Dr. Patricia Hawkins was also part of the scheme. She provided Detective Reed with employee schedules, parking assignments, even medical information that could be used to identify vulnerable targets. Sarah's hands were shaking. She helped them target us? The late shift nurses, the ones walking alone to cars in isolated sections of the parking garage. Dr. Hawkins made sure Detective Reed knew exactly when and where hospital employees would be most vulnerable. Agent Santos reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. Miss Martinez, you weren't just a victim of a random attack. You were the target of a criminal conspiracy that involved gang members, a corrupt police detective, and your own hospital administration. Sarah tried to process the magnitude of what she was learning. The people she'd trusted, worked for, respected, had been actively working to put her and her colleagues in danger. What happens now? Now we get justice. Agent Santos's smile was fierce with anticipation. Detective Reed, Mr. Kowalski, and Dr. Hawkins will all face federal charges. The three men who attacked you are looking at attempted murder charges with gang enhancement, which means minimum 25 years in federal prison. Agent Santos pulled out one final document. But here's what I think you'll find most satisfying. The hospital board of directors held an emergency meeting yesterday. Mr. Kowalski and Dr. Santos Hawkins have been terminated immediately. The board has also voted to offer you full reinstatement with back pay, a formal apology, and a substantial settlement for what they're calling institutional failures in employee protection. Sarah stared at the legal document. The settlement amount had enough zeros to make her dizzy. They want to settle? They want to avoid a federal lawsuit that would bankrupt the hospital. Your story is already going national. The nurse who was attacked for saving a Marine's life, then persecuted by the same people who were supposed to protect her. It's the kind of story that brings down institutions. Agent Santos was right. Sarah's phone had been ringing non-stop with calls from reporters, but these weren't the local vultures who'd initially painted her as a suspect. These were national journalists from CNN, NBC, ABC, all wanting to tell the real story of the hero nurse and the Marines who'd defended her. 60 Minutes wants to interview you, Agent Santos continued. So does Good Morning America. The Marine Corps has officially recommended you for a civilian medal, and there's talk of congressional recognition. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of fortune. A week ago, she'd been facing eviction and the loss of her daughter. Now she was being offered more money than she'd ever seen and recognition she'd never dreamed of. What about my nursing license? The state board was investigating, cleared completely. In fact, the Arizona Board of Nursing is using your case as an example of heroism in the profession. They're creating the Sarah Martinez Award for nurses who demonstrate exceptional courage in emergency situations. There was a knock at the conference room door. Agent Santos called, "Come in," and Danny Torres entered in his dress blues, followed by Master Sergeant Rodriguez and Lieutenant Hayes. "Miss Martinez," Danny said, with a grin that lit up his young face. "I wanted to be the first to congratulate you on your new job." "New job?" Sarah was confused. She already had the VA position. Lieutenant Hayes stepped forward. "The Department of Defense has created a position for you at Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington, D.C. Civilian Emergency Response Coordinator, working directly with military medical teams. The salary is substantial, and it comes with full federal benefits and housing allowances." Sarah looked around the room at all the faces, watching her expectantly. "I don't understand. Why are you all doing this for me?" Master Sergeant Rodriguez answered with the simple honesty of a career military man. "Because you did the right thing when it mattered most, and the system tried to destroy you for it. That's not how America is supposed to work." Danny Torres nodded enthusiastically. "Besides, we owe you more than we could ever repay. This isn't charity, it's justice." Agent Santos gathered up her files and stood to leave. "Miss Martinez, Detective Reed, Mr. Kowalski, and Dr. Hawkins will all face trial within the next 6 months. You'll need to testify, but I think you'll find it satisfying to tell your story to a jury that actually wants to hear the truth." After the law enforcement officers left, Sarah sat alone with the 3 Marines who'd changed her life by refusing to let her story end in tragedy. "I keep waiting to wake up," she said quietly. "A week ago, I was losing everything. Now you're getting what you deserved all along," Lieutenant Hayes said firmly. "Recognition for your courage, protection from the people whose job it is to serve heroes, and the chance to rebuild your life on your own terms." Master Sergeant Rodriguez checked his watch. "Speaking of which, we should probably head outside." "Why?" Danny Torres's grin got even wider. Because there are about 200 Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen waiting to escort you and Emma home. Turns out, military personnel from all over the Southwest wanted to be part of welcoming America's newest hero back to the life she deserves. As Sarah Martinez walked out of the FBI field office into the Arizona sunshine, she saw them, hundreds of military personnel in dress uniforms, forming an honor guard that stretched for 3 city blocks. At the front of the formation, Emma waited with Mrs. Rodriguez, wearing her Marine Corps pin and holding a bouquet of flowers that was almost as big as she was. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as Sarah approached, but all she could see was her daughter running toward her with arms outstretched, her face shining with pride and joy. "Mama, they're all here for you. They said you're a hero." Sarah scooped Emma into her arms and held her tight, tears streaming down her face as she looked out at the sea of military uniforms and grateful faces. For the first time in her life, Sarah Martinez understood what it felt like to be truly protected by the country she'd served with such quiet dedication. She'd learned that heroes weren't always recognized immediately, that justice sometimes moved slowly, but that in America, the truth had a way of eventually fighting its way to the surface. And sometimes, when the system failed, the people it was meant to protect would step up to protect each other. Sarah Martinez had saved a Marine's life in a hospital parking garage, and in return, the United States military had saved her entire world. It was, she thought, exactly how America was supposed to work.